Hello, everyone, and welcome to this current episode of Let's Talk Podcast, a podcast for human skills and mindset. As you see, that we are bringing a lot of guests of diverse skill set of different walks of life, just to make sure that each and every aspects of life has been taken care of. Obviously, I got a lot of different kind of feedback in terms of some people are like, are you not focusing on a particular niche? Some people say that it's good that you are exploring different walks of life. What are the different things in terms of sports, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of entrepreneurship? What we are also planning to discuss more in terms of human skills, human natures, medical, life sciences, and so on and so forth. And definitely, I really appreciate all your feedbacks. Please uh, bring those feedbacks as much as possible because that's a way. It's a two-way communication, and we learn. That being said, today I'm in conversation with Christophe. Christophe is a business program manager in Microsoft France. And the reason why I, first of all, approach Christophe is because though I have read some of his articles about his personal experience, his diversity and inclusion mindset, his efforts about some of the disability chapter which he runs on behalf of Microsoft France. And also, there are a lot of things which he's doing in terms of making you think about something which most of the privileged people may not have in terms of whether your physical disability, neuro, or I would say neurodiversity. I was just trying to look for that term and so on and so forth. So let me just take a pause and welcome Christophe to this show. Christophe, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Definitely. So let's get into a topic about yourself first. So, Christoph, if people may not know you, I know you have a good following, at least on the LinkedIn here, but still, there are a lot of people who may not know because there are a lot of people who are outside of United States and obviously to different countries as well. So, please, if you can enlighten us about yourself.
Of course. So first of all, I'm a Caucasian man, 54 years old. I've got black hair, uh, a bit of a goatee right now with white hairs because this is actually I should have shed it today because it is the end of November.
Okay.
Because
Yes.
usually I don't have a goatee myself. I've got a gray jumper basically and reading
Mhm.
glasses. And what you don't see here is a hearing head on my left ear. So I've been working in the company for a bit less than 19 years. I'm a proud father of two young ladies and married with my wife Karine for about 11 years. Um, I started actually to be pretty active on LinkedIn about 6, 7 years ago when I basically had a burnout. Okay. And I was very vulnerable about it very quickly. And from that day onwards, I think, it became evident for me to be on a mission to talk about mental health in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace. I also have a podcast actually on burnout in French. So for France and French people on French speaking people only. And for the last probably 7 or 8 years, I think before my burnout, actually, I've been very much active on diversity and inclusion within the company. And for the last 5 years, as you said, I've been leading the French Disability ERG chapter at Microsoft France. And actually, I joined the Global Disability Board a few months ago as the one of the comms leads.
That's
So this
great.
is this is me in the nutshell. And as we said prior to the call, um, I love psychological safety, and for me, mental health discussions in the workplace have a right to be basically to exist.
Definitely, and I love the part which you mentioned about. I mean, this is a classic example of inclusion where you mentioned that what you're wearing, and this is something I have to start working towards me as well. And maybe I'll say that I'm wearing a black shirt, and I have my hashtag Let's Talk podcast, which the podcast I run, and I'm not very comfortable speaking those things on live because I'm trying to learn that. But this and these are the interactions helps me as well. And I would encourage everyone to come out of their comfort zone. And when you try to introduce yourself, you have to be included for people who may not be able to see you and how you're describing. So I love that perspective, Christoph.
And I'll teach you. I'll teach you on
Yes.
side discussions.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so that being said, you mentioned that you have burnout story as well. I was reading your article that you have a certain kind of a disability or uh, that part. I mean, maybe I would say that. Would you like to kind of expand? What is that, and how? And obviously, you can also mention about that how people can be comfortable speaking about their disability in a public forum.
Of course. So I'll start, if you don't mind, I'll start with the burnout because
Okay.
that's where I'm starting to be more and more engaged in mental health.
Okay.
And for me, let's face it, even within the disability group or the disability ERG, mental health is actually part of all those disabilities, physical, emotional, cognitive, and so on. So for me, it's all connected. So I had my burnout 6 years ago. It took me obviously a while to recover. And when I started to have my cognitive functions working properly, I started to browse the web, and I'm a big, big fan of TED Talks. And one day, I discovered that TED Talk from Brené Brown, which is one of the most famous ones, about vulnerability. And when I listened to it once, well, I watched it once, then twice, three, four, 5 times, 10 times. And when I understood the message that basically being vulnerable was not being weak, but just on the opposite, being very brave, for me, that was an eye opener. And from that day onwards, I decided to talk about my burnout. And later on, and actually, funny enough, um, right before my burnout, before I collapsed, I started to have a lot of symptoms with my ears. I have to say that I've had hearing issues since I was a baby, basically. When I talk about my deafness, the way that I look at it is like any baby, when they're born, usually they're meant to cry, which is a good sign. So I cried immediately. And after I think maybe a few seconds, I sneezed, which is a bit less common. And so I was born with a cold, I guess. And 3 weeks later, I had my first ear infection. Then I
Hmm.
had chronic ear infections for many, many years. My hearing on the right hand side starting to get worse and worse over the years. Then I got a graft surgery when I was 6. Um, then instead of going to summer camps in when I was younger, I used to go to kind of, well, there were kind of summer camps where during the day we'd go to hospital basically to get treatments for the ears and for the nose and so on. um, so for me, that lasted for many, many years. And during my burnout, one of the symptoms I had, apart from irritation, insomnia, and so on, was again, issues with my ears, my left ear in particular. Um, well, if I describe it very, very simply, and I'm sure that that's going to resonate with you because that's very easy. Where your land, when you take off on a plane or when you actually land, you've got your hearing. You need to basically get rid of the pressure. And you
Hmm.
usually do this figure. With you put your fingers and you try to get rid of the pressure with the nose. For me, that was constant. So I basically had pressure in my left ear 24 hours a day for weeks. We tried every treatment we had. We didn't fix it, and the only way to fix it was to get another surgery in my left ear. I did that. I think 2 months before after I came back from my burnout sick leave. Um, a few months later, I started to experience what do you call them in English? Oh my goodness, um, tinnitus. Okay, in my left ear again. And probably a year later, and that's the irony of it, during lockdown, during the pandemic. um, and I think it was probably more than that, but at the time, my wife and my kids started to complain that I was putting the TV too loud, that I was asking them to repeat constantly and so on. And that's when I realized that something was wrong. And I think in between the two lockdown we had in my country, I went to see an ear specialist, and she confirmed that basically I'd lost most of my hearing in on the left hand side. And I think a few months later, I started to have a hearing aid, which caused a lot of issues as well. Because the way that I would describe it is, it's not like when you've got reading glasses, because I had reading glasses 6 years ago, and when I put them on, I could read. When you've got a hearing aid, it's very, very different. It takes weeks to get used to it. It takes weeks to get all the right testing, to ensure that the bass is correct, to ensure that it is not too loud, and so on. And it also created a lot of fatigue. And from that day onwards, I think from the day that I started to have my hearing aid, just like I did with burnout, I started to communicate internally and externally about deafness, my burnout, because I think companies like Microsoft, when we've got the luxury of having people we can talk about their disabilities or their mental health issues, they should basically, embrace this and encourage people to talk. That doesn't mean that if someone is not ready to talk about his disease, his disability, his mental health, I would never encourage someone to do it. But for those who are brave enough and vulnerable enough, it's so important for others who can identify themselves, and I can tell you that helps a lot.
That's amazing. So, so let me ask you this. As you mentioned that you had your condition for a while. I mean, since you were a baby. Sorry. Was there any time in between where you were really your ears are functioning as a normal human being? And the reason I'm asking is once you are, for example, like if you are already impacted by a certain disability or certain conditions from childhood, you do not know what is the normal looks like. However, once you get to a normal and again go back, then you really feel what you're missing. You're getting what I mean to
No,
say?
no, no,
Yeah.
definitely. The thing is, when I was really young, apparently, because I can still see the diagrams, and the charts from the doctors, my hearing was really bad.
Mm.
Um, and especially in French, which was a bit dodgy, because, well, it's not like in the US. In French, we've got different accents, like even for the E or for the A, and they're being pronounced differently. Um, I was lucky enough not to be discriminated at all at school, but the only thing that made me different is I couldn't identify those different accents, the E and the A and so on and so on. So all I remember when I was young is I had to see the orthophonist every week to teach me how to pronounce those words or those accents. And at the same time, because of obviously my hearing was impacted, I also had to do something with with my inner ear. So I had to do those funny enough those physio exercises and so on. Um, so I remember when I was probably 6, 7 years old. Yes, I couldn't hear properly, or I was, it was a bit complicated, but not to the extent that I was deaf. I really, really began. It's strange, but I really became deaf with my left ear when I was 51, 52. So for many years, I thought I was hearing properly. Let's face it, my deafness probably happened like 4 or 5 years ago, but I never paid attention, especially, the way we work in companies, with headset and so on. You don't really realize because you've got all the stereo in, and you don't really realize. And as I said, it's really when I was not in the office and basically working from home and with my family that I realized something was wrong, because they made me realize something was wrong.
Yeah, yeah. That's totally understandable actually, and I would say relate a bit because my 1.5-year-old daughter at this time she's facing a lot of ear infections, and because of that she had a bit of a hearing loss at this time because of the fluid. So yeah, I can try to relate in a way because that is in a certain situation is happening at my home as well. So and obviously we really wish that these things to be we get away as soon as possible. So that being said, let's try to expand about your burnout story. So you mentioned about your hearing challenges, and then over the period of time, how exactly it works out, how you may not be able to see how other kids are going through, right? They have their own a particular a normal life, what we say, and then you have to take another separate step, which itself has a lot of questions which I have in my mind. But before that, I would like to learn about what is a burnout story, if you can share with the listeners and viewers here.
Of course. So basically, if I give you the whole story, on the 7th of June 2016, and it's amazing how people in burnout remember, the date when they actually broke down. Um, I was working from home that morning. I took my little one to a nanny, and on that day, I actually had my skip level with my director. Um, so I was at home working on my laptop. I had to commute to the office by train, so I had to do, for some reason I had to do an email, whatever. And all of a sudden, Outlook was open on my Surface tablet at the time, and my fingers were on the keyboard, but I never managed to write that email. My fingers were like stuck on the keyboard. Okay, so there was clearly something wrong, and I realized something was wrong. For me, sending emails is something usual, but I never managed to write it. So there's probably some kind of blackout in my mind. So I realized something was wrong. I went to the office by train. Thanks God I didn't drive. Um, then at the time, so we're talking about 6 years ago. So there was no Teams. It was Skype for Business. So I put Skype for Business on. The video comes in. My director says hello in French because she was Irish, but she spoke perfect French. I said, "How are you?" And I said, fell into tears. So I never managed to respond to her. And she only, asked me to basically go home. Obviously, she didn't, she asked me questions, but I never managed to answer any of them. So she said to me, go home, s- call your doctor, give a call to the MS care number, the work psychologist that we are very lucky to have at Microsoft, and just take care of yourself. So I left the open space in tears. Um, Months later, people told me that they actually stopped asking me what was going on. I never replied to them. I don't even recall that. All I remember is I went down the stairs from the building. I called my wife, I called my parents, I called the doctor, and my wife and my parents were very well. Obviously, they didn't realize what was going on. I called my doctor, went to the doctor the following morning, and I think after 20 seconds, he said, well, you're in burnout. Because again, how are you, Christophe? I cried. I never managed to speak. Um, so that was the actual day. And, you're such in a situation at that time when that happens to you. That journey from Microsoft back home, I'd done it, I don't know, tens of times, 20, I don't know,
Mm.
hundreds of times. And managed to get lost on the way back home. Just to give you an idea about how my brain was not functioning properly. So that was the actual day. But before that, you are actually, before being in burnout itself, you got what they call in English the burning phase, which is where you're starting to experience symptoms. We also call them weak signals. Some of them can be very common to everyone in burnout, but some of them can be different. But generally speaking, someone before collapsing would have issues with sleeping. That could be falling asleep, or that could be having insomnia, chronic insomnia like myself. I would wake up at 3 o'clock every morning for about an hour and a half, and then already try to think about, my work, the following day at work, and so on. Um, Irritation. I started to be irritated with my colleagues, and then unfortunately with my family. At the time, I would not manage my nerves, and I would shout at anyone at home. Um, as I said, I started to have my issues with my ears, but I also had issues with my back, had issues with my stomach. So those are, very generic symptom that you usually tell you that something is wrong. And my doctor, on that day, he said, well, I did see the signals, but it's very complicated for a doctor to basically link all the small symptoms together to realize that the person is about to collapse. So this is awareness as well. Let's ensure that when we're starting to experience chronic fatigue, irritation, anxiety, that you even start to be cynical at work, that you feel demotivated. When you link all those different symptoms, you're about to collapse. So this is where you actually need to consult, or actually use again, the MS Care psychologist number. And they're fantastic people. They're fantastic people. Um, and obviously, so this is the burning phase, then the burnout phase, which is not like depression. Depression is usually more ingrained in childhood and the things that happen i- in the past, in your family, and so on, which is usually deeper than burnout. Having said that, I've met with people in burnout for we could have lasted that could have lasted 1 2 years. And in fact, if you don't cure properly your burnout, you can end up in depression, which again is even worse.
Wow. Okay. I think that's what the thing which you mentioned. I really want to summarize that, as you mentioned that before you got to that particular stage where you mentioned that you got stuck and it was a kind of a mental brain freeze, right? You don't know what's going on, and
Exactly.
these things either, I mean, in if you're totally get into a technical phase, then you can say that if some malfunctioning happen in the brain, but obviously this has to have some kind of a precursor events, as you mentioned about the burnout, and when you try to get into a retrospective view about how exactly these things might have changed. And this is one of the wake up call for everyone out here. We know that everyone has a life situations, and we always think that my life situation is more severe than others. This is a normal human I would say phenomenon, and because of that they try to get accumulated over the period of time. As you mentioned that sometimes you burst out at in front of your friends or family or your kids, and sometimes you feel like how come that happens. I mean, I'm not that kind of person. And then because there are a lot of things which is already brewing up on your mind, whether it's related to work, whether it's related to anything, I mean, in your life. And that's why what we say, which I'm now totally believing, is you don't have to balance your work and life. Try to integrate it in a way that you first of all learn the power to say no. And the good part is the organizations like Microsoft provide so much flexibility. When you say no, people try to empathize and understand why you are saying no, right? So if you say yes to everything, you are basically getting into that zone that it would be a time bomb. And this is applicable to anything in your life, whether it's your friends, your family, or your office. Try to create your boundaries because you are not like other people. Maybe one person can do X amount of work in 1 hour, and you can do maybe X minus one, right? So you don't have to compete with everyone else. And this is something which I've learned. I'm a runner, marathon runner, and I know that you always run and you always compete with yourself, not with others.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and this is something when you start try to get and create your habits around it, you have a different kind of awakening, and you always be more curious. And this is one of the thing which I the reasons also which I started podcast to kind of learn from you and other guests out there that how we try to be more inclusive and understand the other person's perspective, because whatever you're saying comes from your experience, your value system, your belief system, and obviously different society has different belief system as well, and
Of
that's
course.
more creating a layers when we talk about the international guests like you, like how exactly you process certain things. So, coming back to the thing which you mentioned about the burnout and the disability. So, one thing I always try to ask people about, what are some of the, I would say, myths about disability? Like when people say that, oh, it's disability, first of all, obviously, people think disability as physical. That is one of the things because what we see, that is how the brain functions and process. But when when you think about disability, and someone asks you that what is one thing you would like to convey to the people who may be privileged enough, may not have any sort of disability. I mean, people may have in a different format and disability, but what's your perspective? What do you say that what is one of the myth of disability in the on the in the world today?
I love the question. And this is something that we are at Microsoft and within the orgs, we talk regularly. Let's bear in mind that I think today, if I'm not wrong, we're 8 billion people on the planet. This is pretty recent
Yeah.
information.
Mhm.
Um, y- if you think that almost 1 billion people in the world has some type of disability, that you start to realize, the impact and obviously the amount of people on the planet with disabilities. So imagine 1 billion people has some type of disability. Now, from those 1 billion people, 70% have what we call invisible disabilities. Okay. And what you said was absolutely correct. People usually think about people in wheelchairs, when in fact, the wheelchair community within the 1 billion is only probably 2%.
Wow.
And we forget, obviously, about all the other types of disabilities. So, all the these troubles like dyslexia, for instance, which is a very, very common. I don't know the global figures, I don't know the American figures, but in France, we usually say that almost 8% of the population has dyslexia, so problems to write and so on and read. And you've got actually seven different types of these troubles. Obviously, we're also talking about neurodiversity, people with ADHD, people on the autistic spectrum, and so on. So when we think about disability, I think the first thing to remember is 1 person out of 8 person basically, has some type of disability. Most likely, the people around you have some type of disability that you don't see.
You don't
And this
see.
is why, awareness is also very, very important because, even our work environment, it's more likely that people, have some type of disability, but they don't disclose. And why don't they disclose? Sometimes because they fear that they're going to be discriminated, they fear that they're going to be stigmatized. It's not pleasant to feel that you're different. And I think this is very powerful. And something I didn't mention at the very beginning, why am I so involved in diversity and inclusion is also, well, I've got my own family issues with disabilities. Some people in my family have some different long-term disease and so on. But I also met someone who made me realize how important that was, and that was Jenny Fleury years ago, our chief accessibility officer.
Hmm.
Jenny we used to work in the same organization. I met her like probably, I don't know, 8, 10 years ago. At the time when our products were absolutely not accessible, and she was already starting to advocate, and that was the time when Microsoft invented or created the disability answer desk, support, basically technical support for people with disabilities. And when she started to be a very strong advocate, and I remember the first time that I listened to her, and generally is prof and deaf. The first time I listened to her, I went back to my hotel room in Bellevue near Seattle at the time, and I started to write about my own deafness. I was so inspired by her story, by her advocacy, um, that from that onwards I said, well, I need to be involved in this because, again, some family members, have some their own disabilities. Right now, at the time, I only felt as an ally. And then, obviously, as I said earlier on, I then became part of that community. But for me, it was that person, meeting that person, who inspired my journey in DNI. And just for the anecdote, because it is very, very important to me, this year at the Microsoft Ability Summit, generally, and that was virtual, unfortunately, but I got the Leadership Advocacy Award um, by Jenny. So Jenny
Oh, wow.
basically, yeah,
Congratulations. That's great.
for me, that was an amazing moment. And having Jenny like saying, "Oh, Christophe, I've been following you for years, and you inspiring," and hearing that from her, was mind blowing for me because that was for me. She is the one that inspires me as a person, as a woman, and as an advocate for the whole community. And she says something beautiful. Most of the time is we as a company at Microsoft, we have a responsibility because we're a major company to break the divide. That's the words that she uses and that the whole community at Microsoft uses. And from now on, it's nothing about us without us. So we all have a say. And I have to say, with Satya, for instance, the whole mindset of the company with our mission, you know that as well. Everything has changed
Yeah.
dramatically in terms of culture. And today, when we create products, we involve people with different types of disabilities from day one, before we produce the product, to ensure that it will suit everyone. That is a huge change of mindset.
Well, that's what a powerful story. Yep. I mean, and this is the power of tribe in a way. Like when you feel a certain way, and when you see other human being either excelling those things which, based on your previous or past belief system, is stigmatized, as you mentioned, or something which may be looked down upon, and which is true. I mean, if you see our previous generations, when we have these disability issues, first of all, the physical one, obviously, from the get go, at least from what I have seen, I'm kind of born and brought up in India. So I have seen that, yeah, those things are definitely looked down upon, and they are sympathized, like, oh, you don't, and give special treatment to consider that you are special, but you are also weak. So that is one thing. And then, obviously, the more severe part is those disabilities which are not even visible. So you rightly mentioned that that is a power, and this is something I really believe, which is baked in the podcast, is about the connection. The human beings are all about connections, how they can unwrap their potential, even if they feel that they are not maybe fitting into the societal norms, what being conducted over there. So regarding this, if you have feel, and this is something which I've seen, there are lots and lots of articles, podcasts like these, and conversations about disabilities, inclusions, psychological safety, and other things. And you must have observed and view those. What's your perspective is, apart from all these things, what we are still missing? Which you think that, okay, these things are still missing. There are people who are talking about it, and sometimes there are people, like, for example, two people are talking about disability, they may not have the disability by, like, individually, but they are discussing about it, and they said, not exactly, or, oh, I think you're missing this particular point. So do you have any those kind of experience that, I think we should do XY thing better to kind of be more inclusive and more create awareness?
Yes, certainly. I think, again, I'm gonna I'm gonna talk about Satya once again. With growth mindset. Um, I read the book from Carol Dweck
Mhm.
years before we started to talk about it at Microsoft. But I think this is, Satya has changed the mindset of Microsoft, where in the past, and remember, I've been in the company for almost 20 years now. In the past, we were looked at the people we knew everything. We knew better than everyone. Okay, and that's the reputation we had as a company. Nowadays, we've got, thanks God, it's more about growth mindset. Learn from your mistakes, even though let's be honest, learning from mistakes can take toll on your mental health. But try we encourage people to take risk and be bold and so on and so on. um, this week, for instance, just to give an example, I was in an excellent conference with another big company, and I'm not going to name them. um, First of all, the wording they used was wrong. They were talking about disabled people within the community. We prefer to use people with disability, even though, don't get me wrong, some people, not everyone agrees. But why is that distinction important? And that's the way that when I want to talk about this, that's the way I define it. 3 or 4 years ago, I was Christophe. I was 51 years old, and so on and so on. Today, I'm the same Christophe. I'm a bit older, but I also have a different ability. I'm party deaf. But am I the same person, or am I a different person? I'm still the same person. And this is what people, if we can explain to people that before looking at the disability of the person, they should look at the person himself or herself. That would be a great start.
Mhm.
Because most of the time, people look at the disability, and I think you said it perfectly as well. People with disability are weak. Well, that's actually the opposite. Because when you look at it, the number of, well, I'm not going to even talk about people in particular, but people with disabilities fight on a daily basis to overcome their disability. So they're very brave. They've, for us engineers, they've got all those workarounds. They've found so many new methods to work around different things, that this is very powerful. So I would say, some people tell me, people with disabilities are extra powers and so on. I don't think so, but at least, we have different abilities to overcome things, um, than people without disabilities will not, will not be able to achieve. Um, so I think it's more about educating people. At the same time, I can tell you, in the RGs, we promote some terms, like, people with disability, and the language etiquettes that we're meant to be using. Sometimes I tell people, you can make a blunder, call me disabled, if that's okay, as long as you learn from it and next time you don't do it again. I'd rather have someone, and this is something I said actually a few days ago to someone. I'd rather you being making a blunder about my disability, or not naming it the right way and so on, rather than ignoring me as a person.
Yeah.
So, call me deaf, I don't mind. Hard of hearing, I don't mind. Disabled, I don't mind, as long as you still consider me as a person. But please look at me as a person, and then, in the back of your mind, yes, this person also has some type of disability. I think this is very important.
Yeah, I think you mentioned pretty few things profound is about the way, first of all, how you introduce. So I have heard different opinions about things like when we interact with differently able people or having challenges. Sometimes, like from the perspective, so there are two perspectives. Obviously, we should be interacting a lot and then try to learn from them. Then there's another perspective is no, I don't want to interact because if I make a blunder, as you mentioned, right, what that show about me? And then how would that be taken? Because I think there's a fine line about biases both the sides, right? For
Of
example,
course,
if I say, Christophe, you are a deaf, right? And the way, the tonality, and then obviously the way how I speak to you, and maybe that is something not inherently I would like to say, but if I'm not sure, I'll keep quiet. That itself is a defeat because you are now not having a authentic conversation. So one thing I always believe in that from both the sides, the people who are creating awareness and the people who are trying to be aware about these things are have an open communication and try to make sure that please make mistakes as you rightly mentioned, make blunders, because until as you start do not start speaking, and again on both the sides try to be more compassionate rather than having a judgmental approach, because you do not know from where that person on both the sides again what their journey looks like. Maybe someone who is coming from a pretty biased opinionated family has those informations, and that's how he's kind of reflecting or she's reflecting. So you have to be considerate and start speaking. And as you mentioned that when you say that I'm Christophe, I'm Saurabh, I'm maybe a differently able person, that also sometimes creates a bit of a bias and stop your brain functioning from a healthy perspective, or a person who may be not, I would say healthy, I would say in a social norm a pretty fit person, uh, and he would say or she would say that okay, he's a differently able, then I have to be now cautious, maybe speak less. So these are some of the con side of the thing. So I think both the sides, when I say both the side, is like the person who are blessed and privileged and the person who are differently able, both have to be compassionate.
I
And
agree.
sometimes
I agree.
when people are on the differently able side, this is also one of the opinions I have heard that they become pretty opinionated in that way as well because they have suffered so far that they said that oh, these people do not understand, and they become sometimes cynical. So I think
I,
yeah,
I
as
agree with
you
that. I
rightly
agree with
mentioned that
that.
we have to be pretty cognizant on both the side of the aisle. Yeah, you were saying something.
And let's remember something as well. Something I haven't mentioned. Because of age, for instance, anybody can, become type of someone with disability, like with hearing and vision and so on. You can, we've got at Microsoft, for instance, we talk about temporary disabilities. Imagine you go skiing and you break your right arm and you're right-handed. Well, I can tell you for at least a month, you're going to be in a disabled situation because you won't be able to write and use your keyboard, and you need, for instance, dictation and so on. Uh, so that disability can happen at anyone at a certain moment in your life, and this is why it's important that we are. And I think coming back to what you were saying, I think everyone needs to be authentic, and yes, they can make blunders, but at least I just hope that people ask at some stage and want to learn, and I think this is the key.
That's great, and that also reminds me one thing about I'm reading one book called Nonviolent Communication. That's such by I think Marshall Rosenberg. That's such an amazing book actually that shows how you can remove conflicts in any kind of a communication by being compassionate and try to listen more and understand why a certain person is behaving, responding, or saying those things. And amazing. I think that is something which I would recommend everyone. That is one of those life changing books, A Nonviolent Communication by Marshall, I think Marshall B. Rosenberg. Amazing book. So that definitely, I would like to mention that. So let's go towards, I would say towards the end part of our conversation. I think we were kind of having more things which I have mentioned about. Okay, let's do one thing. Let's take one more uh, perspective, and then we get to the final part of it. So you have certain experience around your multicultural experience you mentioned, and also your experience in Israel. Would you like to kind of elaborate about what's your experience are around that area?
Sure. So first of all, I'm not going to go into politics. Okay, we're
Yeah.
going to talk about Israel, but not at a political or religious level whatsoever.
Yeah.
uh, the truth is, my family overall is very diverse. Especially through marriages and so on, and I've got, you know, I've got different religions in my family. People live in different countries and so on. So for me, it's always been normal to have people, speaking different languages and from different cultures and so on. In 1990, so I was at the time 21. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. I decided to go to Israel for a few months, and there was one good reason of mine. I had cousins in Israel. I'm not Jewish myself, but
Mhm.
for some reason, I'm not going to linger too much into this. But
Mhm.
part of my family converted to Judaism for very specific reasons,
Mhm.
30 years ago, 40 years ago. So I decided to go and visit them. And at the time, they were living on what we call a kibbutz. A kibbutz is basically a community. It's a bit like, to make it very simple, it's a bit like a socialist community where you live. It's almost like, you live on a farm. At the time in the 1990s, for instance, on my kibbutz, there was one washing machine, or nobody had a washing machine at home. For instance, it was, there was a laundry. You would give your laundry every day. There was one basically place called the Hadar Ha'Ochel, which was the hall where everybody would have the breakfast, the lunch, the dinner together. At the time there was one TV set in that hall, so everybody had to meet together. That type of atmosphere. There was a farm, and there were gates. It was very much the way that Israel got built as well. They created different kibbutzim and so on. But for me, as a foreigner, I was what we call a volunteer. So I was volunteering certain, the first time was probably 3 months of my life. I went there, and the rule was very simple. You can stay with us. You're going to get accommodation, which was very shabby, but that was fun at the time. Um, Food, and the only thing that you need to do is work. Okay, so I was doing any type of work. People would be working on the farm, in the fields, in the kitchen, in the laundry. I worked in the laundry, for instance. Then I work in the factory and so on. But the beauty of it is, apart from the celebration and the fiesta every night, I can tell you, and the fun is, I was surrounded by people from South Africa. I was surrounded by people from Scotland, Ireland, the US, Australia, New Zealand. So all the volunteers were coming from all around the world. And from that time onwards, even though I was already very much into diversity in my mind, I think that's where I started to understand about inclusion because we were all living together. Today, I've got like a brother in South Africa. I've got a brother in well, I've got a few cousins in Israel. I've got a brother in Brazil as well, and we're still in touch, like 30 years later, because that created bonds, and obviously nurturing one another from everybody's culture was just amazing. I don't know. It was like the Babel Tower, people talking in all those languages, talking about their countries, and I came back from those 3 months. I was a different person, honestly. I went back there 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Um, I was much older, and I went there for very different reasons. But again, I met people from around the globe, and it was so rich in terms of meeting with folks. And I actually, the funny thing is, in 1996, I actually emigrated to South Africa because I had so many friends down there, and there were many reasons for me to leave France at the time, positive reasons. But I really wanted to do something different. So for me, that those days, that kibbutz place in particular, opened my eyes, and it was like probably a bit philosophical. All of a sudden it was, oh my god, I am exposing myself to the world. So it's probably a bit too much, but that's exactly how I felt. And today again, there's people I haven't met in 20 or 30 years, but we're still in touch, which is pretty incredible.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Actually, that is very much resonating to my belief system as well. As you mentioned, I always recommend two things to everyone is when they think that how do I expand my horizons? How do I know something which I do not know? I always mention that wherever it's possible, travel as much as possible, and obviously meet people. You do not know that what are some things which gives you that aha moment that, oh, okay, I didn't know that, and then eventually over the period of time you also try to give that particular education to the people who are looking up to you, and then you will be like, wow, how do I get all those wisdom or some information which I didn't have? So yeah, these two things, and it's amazing that you have such a diverse family across the board because not many people have that, and that also gives you so much of perspective, and that also
Diversity,
gives you
yeah.
become more collaborative, more inclusive, and also a sense of belonging to that. So
Oh,
that's
big time,
amazing.
big
Uh,
time, big time.
Christophe, so towards the last part, before we say goodbye, first of all, you have provided such a perspective, and I'm very sure that the listeners and viewers would take a cue of that and make them think, which is again one of the primary goals of this podcast. So, what are the parting thoughts in terms of people who would like to learn more about the diversity and inclusion? There's so much of information out there. If I ask you that instead of getting lost in so much information, what are maybe two or three steps which you would like people to have as a key takeaway from this podcast?
Well, first of all, I think very importantly, if we remember the pandemic, okay, there's 2 years of pandemic and all the lockdowns where everybody was working from home and everybody was basically suffering, on his own because of isolation. Let's bear in mind that we as human beings, we need others, and I think this is essential and crucial. So make sure, if there's one takeaway after this episode today is give a call to someone you haven't talked to for a long time, just to ensure they're doing well, and just to talk. And when you are in the office the following day, probably meet someone in the corridors, say hello, how are you, but take the time to listen to the response. I don't know in the US, I don't know in India, but in France, we say ça va, which is how are you, and you respond ça va, which is basically the same. But it's what we call the social ça va, which is the social how are you. Most of the time people just don't listen to the answer, and I think that is the lack of caring. And this is the way we're doing it. The few times in my life where I met someone in the corridors at the office and said, how are you, and I said, well, actually I'm not doing well, you should have seen the shock on their face. But then they would, and then but then they would stop and really engage in a proper discussion. So I think this is one takeaway. Really engage with people, not with that social caring, but with the proper and authentic caring. I think this is key. And for people at Microsoft, very simply, you've got beautiful ERGs, beautiful employee resource groups. Today we've been talking about disability, but I'm also on a line to women at Microsoft, BAMS, Black at Microsoft, all the different ERGs that we have, the LGBTQI plus as well. Um, we have, a very rich company, very diverse company. Diversity makes us a better company. Let's face it as well. And if you look at the younger generation today, they are looking for companies with a proper meaning. They're looking companies will actually have proper missions in life towards humans, diversity, inclusion, sustainability, the planet, and so on. So just be curious, learn from others, join those ERGs, have those open discussion with anyone. Do not be afraid of making mistakes, as we said earlier on, and just learn to, probably learn to learn. That's probably a good one.
Amazing. Yeah. Learn, reach out to the people. And I think this is one of the best thing which you, obviously you mentioned a lot of things, but one of the best thing which you mentioned, which sticks to my mind is when you say, how are you? Wait, listen, and understand what they are saying. It's just not just for the sake of exchanging pleasantries. So that being said, sorry, Christophe, thank you so much for spending your time, and definitely I'll reach out to you later on as well for any kind of information. And
Please.
yeah, I really appreciate your time on this.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Yeah, thanks.